Yes, it's the world this week. 7 days, 4 Paris-based correspondents, 1 hour. We are in the company of Vivian Walt of...
Oops.
The World This Week, where we're in the company of Vivian Walt of Time magazine. How are you?
Very well.
We're also joined by Mark Burley of the French news agency AFP. Nice to see you again, sir. Andre Sevagora, who we can say works across the street at Eurosport.
I do.
How are you, sir?
Very well, thanks.
And nice to see you as well. Judah Grunstein of World Politics Review, which you can find where?
worldpoliticsreview.com.
Okay. The World This Week, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, our hashtag F24Debate. Let's begin with the latest from the world of sports. Ireland qualifying for the World Cup, more precisely, the FIFA World Cup corruption scandal. Last summer, a claim that FIFA paid hush money to stop the local football federation from suing over Thierry Henry's handball pass that qualified the French at the expense of the Irish for the 2010 World Cup came out. At the time, the Irish edition of The Sun rebaptized the Hand of Frog as the Handout of Frog. I don't know if you could see it there. They add a little out there. However, it turns out, after a week that's seen FIFA's seemingly immovable supremo knocked off his perch, that story about Ireland was true.
And that was a Thursday, and on Monday the agreement was all signed and all done. It's a very good agreement for the FAI, a very legitimate agreement for the FAI. I'm bound by confidentiality for naming the figure. You've put a figure out there,
right?
And fair play to you. It was a payment to the association not to proceed.
Andre Sevagora, first of all, explain to us, why did FIFA pay money to Ireland for a lawsuit they probably would have lost?
I think Ireland would have had no chance of winning at all, which is why it's so surprising. It shows just the culture of, first, how much money there was and is around FIFA and how easy it is to throw it around. They just didn't want any bad publicity. And this case...
So €5 million is something you put with the parking tickets?
Yeah, it's pocket change. But this really is more serious for me than anything that went on the 10 days before. Because,
more serious?
Yeah, I'll tell you why. Simply because this touches the integrity of what goes on the pitch. Remember, Ireland wanted the game to be replayed. I think fans and sponsors, they can put up with men in grey suits on the take. It's been happening in football for decades. But when it starts affecting actually the game itself, this is when it gets really dangerous. Remember athletics, what happened with the doping scandal. Athletics now is ignored between Olympic Games. That won't happen with football, but this is why this case in Ireland, which is true, it definitely did happen. It's a question of whether it was a loan or whether it was a payment. It's very, very serious for football.
Very serious for football. Do you think that without that payment, the game could have been replayed?
No, because I remember I was in this very studio the day after the Hand of Frog, Hand of Henry, whatever you want to call it. There was a match between Egypt and Algeria, which caused a huge diplomatic dispute. There were 9 minutes of injury time played, and Egypt scored in the 9th minute of injury time. Algeria would have had a perfectly good case to go to FIFA as well. Every day in football, the referee makes mistakes, but we've never had a lawsuit, and this has always been an area that FIFA has refused to go into. They don't want to get involved in national law courts because that opens up a whole can of worms for them. That's why it's surprising to me that they agreed to pay that money, which they say was a loan. But again, what's really worrying is not the fact whether it was a loan or a gift. It was not recorded on anyone's books. There was no record of this until a couple of days ago. John Deloney saying, "Oh yeah, we got €5 million from FIFA." It's not in FIFA's books anyway. It's been completely covered up. That's the problem.
All right, the good name of football has been tarnished. Let me show you here one reaction on Facebook from Myra. France and South Africa might have paid bribes to host the World Cup. Of course, there's no allegations yet when it comes to France. But Qatar, on top of paying bribes, they have despicable human right abuse for the foreign workers. It's, I guess, an understatement to say, Vivian Walt, it's not been a good week for the beautiful game.
No, I thought you were going to say it hasn't been a good week for Qatar, which it certainly hasn't either. What's amazing to me, it's what Andreas was saying. You know, FIFA for so long has sort of been like this bottomless ATM. You've only got 209 football associations. Each one of them essentially has equal power. And so, there has been billions. I mean, FIFA made $5.7 billion in the last 4 years. there have been billions to spread around wherever you need a vote, support. And what's amazing to me is that until the US indictments, nobody really thought that this was a system that realistically was going to get shaken up. Everybody grumbled about it. There were scandals, there were articles, investigations, but no one really thought that there was going to be any real change. And now you just see the dominoes sort of falling in so many different directions.
Another reaction, Mark Burley, this one on Facebook from Kenneth. The rumors were true. The World Cup is a scam. Now, you're a football fan. Is the World Cup a scam?
I think by the time, that amount of money involved and, such worldwide attention, I don't think it comes as any surprise there was corruption. What is a surprise is that it's the Americans. We're relying on the Americans to clean up something that, has a heart in Europe. And I'm kind of disturbed about that. I would have liked to have seen Europe in some guys take the lead on this. It's also a bit of a worry that, I'm not really convinced that the Americans, they're looking at this from a personal tax perspective. They're not looking at it in the same way the Europeans do, that would also somewhere want to safeguard the game for the fans.
All right, you're not the only one who's worried about that, by the way. Russia's president has also been worried about the fact that this is all coming from the land of soccer. Vladimir Putin speaking last week when the scandal broke. All right, we'll hear from Vladimir Putin later. Putin basically saying that this is American overreach again.
Well, what's interesting is the way in which after the scandal broke, or after the indictments were announced, the support for or the criticism of Sepp Blatter kind of broke down along similar lines to what's happening in the UN, for instance, where you had Europe and the United States very critical of the management of FIFA. At the same time, you had Putin defending FIFA and defending Sepp Blatter and sort of accusing the United States of meddling the way they've accused the United States of meddling in the internal politics of various countries. And also the way in which I believe a lot of African federations...
Those are the leaders, right? And yes, the heads of the African confederations as well.
They lined up behind Sepp Blatter because he very skillfully used to manage the politics of buying loyalty and buying.
But how do ordinary citizens feel about all this?
Well, that's the other thing that's interesting is that usually one area of the world where the reaction was very different was in Latin America. And usually there's a lot of anti-Americanism in Latin America. But at this point, this time there were so many Latin American officials that were involved, and there's also this sort of movement or this emerging outrage across the region about corruption in their own countries that it drove a lot of anger. And what happened was that the governments, to try to divert attention away from their own corruption scandals, started launching investigations. Even Colombia, I think, which wasn't really involved, started launching an investigation.
What message is this giving to you to ask about ordinary Africans? The leaders of African football are saying, as long as the money keeps rolling in, corruption is fine, and bribery is just part of the cost of doing business. And that's shameful. And remember, the number 2 to Blatter is another African.
I mean, if you listen to, if you read just the blogs coming out of Africa, the tweets or whatever, for ordinary people, they haven't seen those millions. You travel around Africa, every African capital now has a fancy new stadium. It's not built with FIFA money, it's built by the Chinese. And the millions that have gone into these football associations have not been seen to be trickling down to neighborhoods or, local football clubs.
And in a country that you know well, South Africa, the news that there was this $10 million payment that went for the building of a African diaspora youth program in the Caribbean.
Completely not to be believed. And, obviously South Africa is a different case. I mean, there you have tremendous amount of criticism about the government corruption, and the World Cup really brought that to a head, because here you had enormous stadiums being built largely in areas where they had to evict people from, or that have simply not been used very much ever again.
But it is a source of pride, isn't it, for South Africans? They're the first nation on the continent to have hosted a World Cup.
Sure, there was, but they didn't see very much come out of it ultimately.
Well, look at Cape Town. Cape Town built this wonderful new stadium with Sepp Blatter insisting that a new stadium be built when they've got a perfectly good rugby stadium. Why? It looked great on television. They wanted to show Robben Island, where Nelson Mandela was for so many years, pan across to see a lovely new football stadium. I mean, this is the kind of level that FIFA are at, and I think it was $300-400 million stadium. It hasn't been used once.
25 miles probably from the nearest kind of real soccer community.
At the same time, the two things that you said, I think, are very important. The first thing being the idea that the real danger is if this starts going onto the pitch, if there starts being revelations that the corruption actually impacted the outcome of the game. Because the truth is that obviously people are complaining and people are outraged. But this was an open secret. Everyone knew this was going on, and it was almost like a running joke. I mean, Qatar getting the World Cup at
that's
100
one consequence. Qatar has to lose it now.
Yeah, well, 115 degrees in the summer, and they get the World Cup. I mean, what could go wrong? Yeah. But the point being that that panning from Robben Island to the stadium and the whole image management of global soccer, of global football, has people eat it up. There's no people want it, and they're almost willing to live with it as long as it's not too flagrant, as long as it is kind of hidden and not traced. And I think that I suspect that even the outrage will blow over in the sense that
I'm not sure if that's true. I mean,
don't
there
think
was protests in Brazil for months before the World Cup. The Brasilia Stadium, which I think is the world's most expensive stadium ever built, is now completely unused, and
that had to do a lot with the fact that the government was spending money on building stadiums when instead of at the same time or just before an austerity program, and at a time when people were demanding more money going to public transportation and things
hold
like
on.
that.
Let me put this to Mark Burley, because you used to be stationed.
Don't ask me how much that stadium costs.
No. You used to be stationed in Brazil.
Yeah.
We saw in June of 2013 there were these unprecedented demonstrations that took place against high cost of living. Was it worth it? The cost, the corruption in Brazil. Would you say that in a way, Sepp Blatter has been an unwitting ally in Brazil's march towards more transparency, when we see the public pressure today being applied over, say, that scandal at the oil company Petrobras?
I think the Brazilians are just generally pissed off with corruption at their local level. It plays over to the government in cahoots with this organization that's doing it when there were more pressing priorities. And now with the state of the Brazilian economy today, which is really awful and sliding fast, I think they were right. But in the end, national pride and samba in the street overruled any sort of qualms they had in the end. They protested, but it wasn't as big as it could have been. It's not as big as we're seeing more enduringly against the government now.
There's a human resources issue. I mean, I've had the dubious pleasure of meeting some of these football administrators, some important, some less so. Some of them, honestly, you wouldn't trust with a car boot sale. I mean, this is a supranational organisation that has no oversight, is beyond and above the law, and they're in charge of €5 billion. But I should say, in defence of Blatter, not something I thought I'd say, this man has multiplied by 20 the revenues coming in to FIFA over 20 years as a chief executive. He's unparalleled in his success, and we have to say that outside of the tech sector. I challenge you to name a chief executive that's multiplied revenues by 20 in 18 years.
Andres, I want your reaction to something. Sepp Blatter's resigned, but he's not gone yet. He, on Thursday, putting out a tweet saying, working hard for reforms after meeting Audit and Compliance Committee Independent Chairman Scala. There you see him sitting diligently at his desk.
Here I am.
That was dated
I want
2003, by the way. That's the
I want to
12-year-old
reform the past 20 years of my mandate. Is that what he's doing?
You come to the stage, obviously the same people cannot do it. And the danger is FIFA is not led by Blatter, but for every Blatter there's a Chuck Blazer, every Chuck Blazer there's a Jack Warner, and you have to bring in the right people to football. And somehow we have to avoid this concentration of power in football, so one man just doesn't have so much power.
And if you read the fine print on his resignation, he doesn't leave until December at the earliest.
Well, they have to call a new extraordinary Congress, which has never happened before. That gives him time to chat with the other 209 members at FIFA and maybe anoint a successor. So let's not presume that the new guy will be squeaky clean. And as has been alluded to before, it's very unlikely it will be European.
For a
Because
guy-
he's lost that power base completely.
For a guy who likes going around in a private jet, he could well end up as honorary president or something after all this anyway.
That was one of the points made, by the way, Judah Grunstein this week, was that the upshot of all this was you'll never see another Olympics or World Cup on U.S. soil.
That's certainly possible. I mean, the thing is, I don't mean to suggest that any of this is tolerable or isn't unacceptable. It is. At the same time, it's very human. Money confers privilege, prestige, and power. And as long as that's the case, people are going to want it. And as long as they can get it without other people knowing, they'll do it, and they'll be easily corrupted. So the idea that just getting rid of Blatter is going to change things, really, it would need a top-to-bottom and a bottom-to-top reform of the organization. And even that, it would take a little time, but eventually other channels will emerge. It's human nature. It's not something that you can eradicate. You can fight against it, and you can try to limit it. But it's something. It's one of the vices that we live with.
How the hell did KPMG, the auditors, miss $150 million in bribes off the books? How did they miss that?
Well, this has been done in cash quite often. I mean, Jack Warner has talked about literally bagfuls of $10,000 worth of cash being handed out.
There's also wire fraud in the
Correct.
U.S. indictments. And, I mean, the great thing about the U.S., I take what Mark says about this, overreach of power. But here you have the U.S., these laws were made for the mafia. And actually, FIFA's a lot like a mafia. They have the perfect legal structure to do this. The RICO laws in the US, which took down the mafia, were just tailor-made for an organization like FIFA.
Yeah, but if you look at the Chuck Blazer testimony, what do you call it? The paperwork that he when he appeared in court there, subpoena, yeah, in there, they were keeping it very much within the scope of what the US could touch. They didn't want to touch the things that were happening only in the Caribbean. They sort of said that the check, I think, for South Africa, he had in his pocket as he went through JFK Airport. They're keeping it very much American-centric, which I'm worried about because FIFA is worldwide, and there is a larger case than what the Americans can make against it. And if we're going to see real transparency happen and be injected into it, it's not the Americans only who can carry this. They care about the tax issues, and they care about banks and wire fraud, and you used email because you used an American server, maybe, but what about all the rest of it?
That is why it's important that, for instance, a lot of the Latin American governments have open investigations so that they will, in their own jurisdiction, be able to go after something. I just want to point out one little thing that, as much as
Very
people
quickly.
tend to mock the U.S. being involved in this, in cleaning up global soccer, the U.S. women's team has been dominant for at least 10 or 15 years. So I just want to point that out. The United
actually, I
States
think
is
soccer
a
is
soccer
one of-
power.
Soccer
All right.
is an enormous sport now in the US.
Indeed.
Don't
All
use
right.
the word soccer, it's football.
Let's hope there'll also be more gender equality on the board at FIFA in the future. Stay with us, there's much more to come. We're going to look at the hard bargaining going on between Greece and its creditors. Are they tempting fate? Stay with us.